Earlier today, the Washington Post reported on a new study from the New York University Center for Social Media and Politics that extensively analyzed the impact of Russian Twitter bots on the 2016 election and found, surprise, that their impact was trivial to non-existent. One of the things that we see from this study, which is entitled Exposure to the Russian Internet Research Agency Foreign Influence Campaign on Twitter and the 1916 election, and its relationship to attitudes and voting behavior, is the following, quote, "We find no evidence of a meaningful relationship between exposure to the Russian foreign influence campaign and changes in attitudes, polarization, or voting behavior. The results have implications for understanding the limits of election interference campaigns on social media." It goes on. "We find that exposure to posts from Russian foreign influence accounts was concentrated among a small group of users, with only 1% of users accounting for 70% of all exposures. Exposure to Russian foreign influence tweets was overshadowed by the amount of exposure to traditional news media and U.S. political candidates, meaning the billions of dollars poured into our election overshadowed the handful of bots on social media from Russia." They went on. "Respondents with the highest levels of exposure to posts from Russian foreign influence accounts were those arguably least likely to need influencing. Those who identified themselves as highly partisan Republicans who were already likely favorable to Donald Trump." And then finally, "We did not detect any meaningful relationship between exposure to posts from Russian foreign influence accounts and changes in respondents' attitudes on the issues, political polarization, or voting behavior. Each of these findings is not independently dispositive." Now, Michael Tracey, the independent journalist who's been on the show before, was one of the few journalists with the courage to express deep skepticism of the Russiagate fraud from the very first moment it emerged from the bowels of the FBI, CIA, and Hillary Clinton's embittered desperation to win what was rightfully hers, the American presidency. And we'll discuss this new study and much more with him in our interview segment right now. Good evening, Michael. Thank you so much for taking the time from your very busy schedule to join us tonight.
Always a boundless joy to do so.
It's thrilling to see you always out of a car. We're very happy when you appear in a more civilized setting. So, first of all, let me just ask you. I consider
renting a car just so I could do it from a dark parking lot.
Exactly. Let me just ask you, I know you read that study. I don't think it's full of what I'd call bombshells, although it's good to see, I suppose, liberal data experts affirming what has been clear for a long time. What do you make of that study?
Well, I know that I'm supposed to stand up and cheer that my so-called narrative or my interpretation of the significance of Russian social media interference was supposedly vindicated by the study, but I have to say I wasn't in a particularly joyful mood having read it, because I couldn't help but wonder, why is it that there is such an enormous amount of resources still being poured into this area of study, where you have these associations of academics from the world over spending all their time getting incredibly deep into the granularity of the effects of this particular alleged social media campaign from now over 6 years ago. And one of the first people to actually share this study on social media was Craig Newmark, the Craigslist founder, who hasn't been associated with Craigslist for some time, but he runs one of these philanthropic networks that goes around funding study after study on the supposedly pernicious influence of social media interference on democracy. So, he, along with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, all kinds of other endowments and so forth, they're listed as the financial benefactors of this particular study in the acknowledgments section of the research article. And you have to wonder, why is it that this is such a major priority of these nonprofit entities still at this juncture? Well, there's a clue in the conclusion that they arrive at. So you're right that they do conclude that there was negligible impact that they could discern based on their methodology of the Internet Research Council having proliferated a certain number of bots and on Twitter in the months ahead of the 2016 election on the individual political preferences or voting behavior of the self-selected panel of people that were studied. I mean, some of the methodology here is questionable. I mean, they're talking about people who voluntarily chose to submit themselves for research study based on their Twitter accounts, and then they study impressions of Twitter content that these specific individuals garnered as a result of extrapolations based on the accounts that they followed on Twitter. Like, they can't even verify if they saw any one individual piece of content. It's a lot of just extrapolation and like statistical finessing going on to seem more impressive or reliable than it is. But then they come to the conclusion that, again, although there was no major difference that could be established in terms of voting behavior before and after these individuals were exposed to this allegedly Russian-derived content, they do come up with this kind of more theoretical conclusion, which is that Russia's foreign influence campaign, this is a quote, on social media, may have had its largest effects by convincing Americans that its campaign was successful. So they're talking about like a second or third order efficaciousness of this Russian influence campaign, not based on the actual efficacy of the content that was put out onto this one particular social media platform, Twitter, but in how the efficacy of the campaign was reported on or understood or perceived by the wider public. And so the one place where I would have to quibble with the way that they phrase that conclusion is that they kind of lay blame on the Russian social media trolls themselves for, quote, convincing Americans that the campaign was successful. Well, as we now know, and as this study even helps to establish, the campaign itself was trivial. It was negligible. Most people who interacted with these kind of scattered accounts would never have known that it had anything to do with any kind of foreign influence campaign. The only reason why that later became such a preoccupation is because it was declared as much by a kind of concerted tandem between the American security state apparatus and the media to themselves convince everyone that there was this massive problem that had to be reckoned with for the sake of democracy. And so, I mean, think about it this way, Glenn. If they had established through whatever cockamamie methodology they're using that, let's say there was a 2% efficacy of these Russian trolls supposedly on influencing Americans' individual voting behavior or political preferences, would that then mean that they were vindicated in having been so obsessed with this narrative for 6 years? I don't really buy that premise. I think the premise itself is sort of overblown. Even the impetus for doing the research that they're doing is overblown, so that it happened to incidentally come to the conclusion in this one particular instance that, oh, they couldn't really establish any kind of major correlation between viewership of these memes and trolling accounts and actual modification of voting behavior, I think it's just kind of, again, an incidental result that we shouldn't take too much stock in, because they still buy into all the premises that undergird the narrative.
Of course, first of all, I mean, I can't prove this because we don't have the evidence yet for demonstrating that it's the case, but these are people who are affiliated with NYU, which is... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.